Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. In today's coverage, we want to have a discussion about what is happening in Minnesota. Now, this is an ongoing issue where we have the U.S. Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, that includes ICE and then elements, obviously, of the U.S. Border Patrol and various other federal agencies that are now operating in various parts of Minnesota, specifically Minneapolis, St. Paul area. Now, first, before I kind of get into the reason ICE is in Minnesota, and we'll have a brief discussion on that, and I think after that discussion, it may or may not make sense to you, the viewer. Most of you, it will. Most of you will fully understand what is happening, why it is happening, and why it, most importantly, is necessary. Now, I want to go back to January 18th, and specifically the attack that took place on the city's church in Minneapolis. It was at the avenue of Summit Avenue and Snelling Avenue South. This area here, just to the east of, I believe this is McAllister College, right? Yeah, the schools don't have anything to do with this, do they? Anyway, so, as most of you know, may know by now, that Don Lemon, the fired CNN news anchor from CNN, was involved in this attack, in this obstruction attack against this peaceful church. It was a Baptist church, predominantly made up of white residents, white Americans, going to worship at this city's church. The group that was involved in the attack was made up predominantly of Black Lives Matter and Antifa types that were also given the umbrella of protection by Don Lemon. Now, how did Don Lemon, a.k.a. Don Lemon, provide protection for this radical left-wing group to attack this church? Well, because of his presence. Because of his presence and his quote-unquote journalistic integrity and the ability to have a camera system present, gave protection to this group. Now, first you have to understand that this was not an issue where the BLM, Black Lives Matter, and Antifa types attacked the church, entered the church, trespassed upon the church grounds without permission after being told to please leave. Yeah, that's called criminal trespass. Criminal trespass. You just can't go and enter someone's private property or a group's private property, and then when you are asked to leave, you do not leave. Now, first, this group assembled at a different location. Where that location was, we're not exactly sure. I'm sure we can get that information. But that grouping, in terms of that preparatory activity of the group assembling at a staging area prior to the attack, occurred with Don Lemon. Don Lemon staged and prepared to attack the church with this group. So Don Lemon and these neo-Marxist left-wing radicals that despise private property, except Don Lemon's property. Don Lemon can have private property, but you, an ordinary American citizen, are not allowed to have private property. You're not allowed to do that. So Don Lemon and this group staged. They discussed what they were going to do. It's very likely that at least a number of these individuals were, in all probability, armed, either with knives or guns. So they staged with Don Lemon, and they entered the church. They drove to the church, they parked, they got out, and then they entered the church, causing a disruption. They were yelling, they were screaming, they were using something called fighting words, words that are designed to cause conflict, to instigate a possible physical altercation while inside the church. They were not invited inside the church. They were told to leave the church. Don Lemon was told to leave the church. And Don Lemon, after being criminally trespassed by this church, refused to leave the church. He claims that he was a journalist. But again, he is not a journalist, as he staged with and concocted a plan with these Black Lives Matter and Antifa-type protesters to enter the church, take control of the church, harass the parishioners, and not leave the church until they deemed it necessary to finally leave. That's what they did. Now, what could have they done? What could have these left-wing radical protesters, what could have they done? What are they allowed to do? Well, they could have certainly parked in a public parking area, and they could have used this public sidewalk to walk up and down and protest. If this was truly a protest about ICE, about the immigrations and customs enforcement activity that is taking place in Minnesota, they could have certainly walked up and down the sidewalk, and they could have protested in that manner. And yes, Don Lemon could have then gone and interviewed these protesters as they walked up and down the sidewalk protesting. They could have done that. They could have absolutely have done that. But where they crossed the line is where they orchestrated this trespass operation, this attack against the church, where they crossed the sidewalk and then forcibly entered the church and then refused to leave the church. And if you watch the videos, and there are many videos out there of what happened, these people are very aggressive, and they were acting as if they wanted to seek a physical altercation with these churchgoers. Now, I think the most important piece of this, the most important part of what happened, is the why. Not the why in terms of the fact that they were protesting, but the audacity to form up, to get with Don Lemon, and then to enter the church and refuse to leave. Why are they able to do that? Well, I'll tell you why they're able to do that. They do not fear you. I'm going to say this again. They do not fear you. They did not, those individuals that were entering the church, including Don Lemon, did not fear the repercussions and the accountability of their actions. Local law enforcement. Local law enforcement, led by left-wing radicals. The city is run by left-wing radicals. The state is run by a left-wing radical that enjoys going to communist China on a number of occasions. Law enforcement, in terms of the Minneapolis Police Department, was not responding to these sorts of calls. They pick and choose law in Minnesota. Some laws are to be enforced, and some laws are not to be enforced. And that's the environment that people are living in Minnesota, and specifically Minneapolis, as we speak. So when the rule of law breaks down, what happens? When organized government law is no longer protecting private property rights, and this is a key value for both the society of Minnesota and the society of America, of the United States at large, where private property rights can simply be disregarded based on who is entering that property and terrorizing the owners of that property. And in this case, Don Lemon and these radical left-wing protesters were deemed by the city government of Minnesota to be left alone, to allow them to violate the law, to enter this private property of the city's church and harass and assault and accost the parishioners of this church, the churchgoers, those there to worship God and Jesus Christ in this particular incident. Now, let's just compare and contrast, right? What if an Islamic facility had been entered by right-wing Americans, quote-unquote right-wing Americans? What would have happened then? What do you think would have happened? Would Don Lemon have entered an Islamic mosque with right-wing protesters? Probably not. And what would have happened? Well, at that point, natural law would have taken over. And that's what should have happened with City's church. And I reasonably believe that natural law still needs to occur in terms of accountability for Don Lemon and those principal leadership functionaries that decided to enter that church. What needs to happen, or should have happened, and could still happen, is that those who would like to take action, that those who are doers need to do. Again, on January 18th, these individuals, these left-wing radicals, entered this church because they did not fear the repercussions of entering this church. Under natural law, because no longer is governmental law, city law, state law providing protection for this city's church. Natural law needs to provide protection. That means the churchgoers, that means that some possible military members of that church should have taken action, kinetic action. Don Lemon will continue to abuse his perceived journalistic credentials and attack what he sees as conservative America because he does not fear the repercussions. Don Lemon needs to fear the repercussions. Don Lemon and those individuals that entered the church, again, do not fear the repercussions. If they feared the repercussions, And again, this is where individuals that are willing to do must do. They must implement accountability and create fear. Not fear of Don Lemon sitting in his home. Well, maybe now. But the idea that he can freely stage with left-wing radicals and orchestrate an attack on a church. He was totally okay with doing that. And you must make him fear doing that in the future. Has to happen. Otherwise, we will continue down this road of essentially what is becoming the abolishment of private property rights. That's what this is about. This is partly about the Antifa, the BLM, these left-wing radicals, because they don't like what you say or what you believe. They believe they have the right to enter your private property and harass you. It's the great hypocrisy. Again, if something like this were to occur in an Islamic mosque, I mean, really, honestly, what do you think would have happened? What would have been the response from these left-wing radicals? I can promise you they would not support it. But because they do not like what you say at this church, they're willing to harass and assault you. And that's what they're doing. All right, now let's circle back and just have a quick discussion about why immigration and customs enforcement is even in Minnesota. Now, look, I've heard this narrative that, well, ICE is in Minnesota, and there maybe is between 150 to 250,000 illegals inside of Minnesota. Why are they there? Why are they not operating where there are more possibly illegal immigrants living, such as in Texas and Florida and other locations as that? Well, it's really simple. It's very, very simple. Let me try to explain to you, the viewer, why this is happening. So let's say in Minnesota you are arrested. Let's say your name is Pablo Escobar, and you are arrested because, one, you do not belong in the United States. You entered the United States illegally, or you have overstayed your visa, your allowable time inside the United States. And two, not only have you entered the United States illegally or have overstayed your visit, but you have decided, Pablo Escobar, to commit a crime in the United States while being here illegally. Well, what happens? What would normally happen? Well, when you commit that crime, Pablo Escobar, and you are illegally here in the United States, obviously you would be arrested for whatever the crime is. Felony, misdemeanor, depending on the severity of the misdemeanor, you would then be taken to a local detention facility or a city jail or a county jail. At that point, you would be booked in, and then you would be charged with whatever crime that you are charged with locally. Now, once the disposition of that charge is resolved, if you are here illegally prior to being let free of the jail, either by bonding out or the disposition of that charge, that was caused by your first contact with law enforcement, not the fact that you're here illegally, but you committed a crime here in the United States, right? What the Minneapolis Police Department is supposed to do is, one, honor the Immigration and Customs Enforcement detainer. So what happens is, normally speaking, they would, in conjunction with whatever bond requirements locally that are being held against Pablo Escobar, you will also get a Immigration and Customs Enforcement detainer hold. And at that point, after the charges are dispositioned, your local charges, you then essentially have about 48 hours to then be picked up by Immigration and Customs Enforcement. So ideally, what should happen is Minnesota or Minneapolis local police department, the city police department of Minneapolis, should send a notification to Immigration and Customs Enforcement that they have this individual here on a ICE detainer. And then what will happen is ICE would make arrangements to come pick that individual up. They'll also evaluate the severity of what's happening in terms of the existing charge, and then possibly, are there other charges, or is this individual unlawfully here in the United States? And then they'll make that determination to transport them to a Immigration and Customs Enforcement detention facility, in which they will await an immigration hearing. That is what is supposed to happen. What Minneapolis is doing, in many other blue states around the United States, is they are not honoring those ICE detainers. So ICE would not be in Minnesota if Minnesota was honoring those ICE detainers. So again, you're Pablo Escobar, you're here illegally, you commit an additional crime, you go to a city jail, your charge is dispositioned, and then you essentially are held an additional 48 hours for ICE to come pick you up and take you to a ICE detention facility. In a normal world where Minneapolis was following federal law and procedure, local law enforcement procedure, that is what would happen. They are not doing that. In fact, what we have also seen in many cases is, let's say you are Pablo Escobar and you are arrested in Minneapolis, or you're a Somali criminal gang committing masses of fraud in the state. What is happening is the local district attorney acknowledges you that you are here illegally, and then will make an agreement with you that they will not prosecute, and they essentially let them go. So they are being treated differently than, let's say, an ordinary American citizen. An ordinary American citizen would be charged with a crime. In many cases, these illegal immigrants are simply being let go because they know they're illegal immigrants. And they're not even charging them locally. That's what is happening. So again, back to the whole concept of why is ICE not operating like this in parts of Texas? Texas, in most cases, not all cases, but most cases, are honoring those ICE detainers. So when Pablo Escobar is arrested in Texas for a third DUI or a fourth domestic violence action, Texas is notifying ICE and placing a detainer on that individual. And then ICE comes, picks them up, and then they kick them out of the country, as they should be. Look, if you don't belong here, don't come here. If you don't want to be picked up by ICE, don't enter the country illegally or overstay your visa. In any other nation state on the planet, if I were to go to Mexico or Canada and overstay my visa, or for that matter, enter Canada or Mexico illegally, I am going to be deported. And if I commit a crime while being in your country illegally, I am going to be prosecuted and then deported. I'm probably going to do time in a Canadian or Mexican jail, and then I'm going to be deported. These left-wing, batshit crazy states that want to change the population metrics of their state to swing more left-wing voter are not allowing this to happen and are not following U.S. law. They are choosing, as was done under the Biden administration, to increase the left-wing Democratic vote, the Democrat vote. They allowed millions upon millions of illegal immigrants to enter this country. And not only that, they were being very lenient upon them when they would commit crimes. So there was a double standard, and there is a double standard. If you are a U.S. citizen and you commit a crime, you are more likely to be prosecuted locally under some of these left-wing municipalities than if you were an illegal. There is a higher chance, a greater chance that you would be let go. And that's a fact. And that's what is happening. That is why ICE is operating in Minnesota. Because Minnesota is choosing not to honor ICE detainers. That is why they are operating less aggressively in Texas, in Florida, because local, state, and municipal police and sheriff's departments are being more aggressive in terms of following federal law and placing these ICE detainers on these illegal aliens that have entered the country illegally and commit crimes. And yes, it should go beyond that. It should not just be focusing on those individuals who commit crimes. It should be, if you enter this country illegally, you need to go. If you can't do the time, don't do the crime. If you come here illegally, you can expect eventually to be caught and shipped back to your country. And that should happen. And right now, we have barbarians not at the gate. They have entered the city. The barbarians are here. You have individuals from barbaric nation states like Somalia, nation states in Western Africa, in Central Africa, that are utterly barbaric. And those individuals are coming here en masse, and they are going to change the fabric of the United States. Your way of life, both here and in Europe, where they're doing exactly the same thing, will be forever changed. And you will never get it back unless you pick up a rifle and you take it back. Good day.